Who is the highest-ranking U.S. military officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater? Excluding friendly fire, excluding the Pacific theater, and excluding those who died in car accidents after the war ended, this person was killed by German weapons oil during combat operations against Germany. You would probably say Patton, but Patton died in a Jeep accident months after the surrender, not in combat. You might also think of Leslie McNair, but he was killed by U.S. bombers in a friendly fire incident during Operation Cobra, one of the most severe friendly fire incidents of World War II, a tragic and regrettable event. The real answer is a two-star general shot and killed by a German tank commander on the night of March 30th, 1945, while riding in an open Jeep at the head of his own armored column. Just 45 years old, only 5 weeks before the war ended. In every major battle from Normandy to the Rhine, he commanded the most fierce and capable armored division of the U.S. Army. His division captured more enemy soldiers than any other armored division in the entire Army, creating astonishing battle records. His troops loved him deeply, almost to the point of worship. The Corps commander called him the best division commander in the business, a master of armored warfare. Eisenhower described him as one of our bravest and finest soldiers, a priceless treasure to the U.S. Army. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall publicly paid tribute, calling him a great American soldier, a model for all soldiers. Yet 5 weeks later, when the war ended, the military quietly sealed away his achievements as if they had never happened. An entire generation forgot his name, leaving this great commander to sleep in the dust of history. He was Maurice Rose, the son of a Jewish rabbi from Denver, Colorado. He always led from the front because he firmly believed that a general should stand at the forefront. At the same time, this Jewish officer registered himself as a Protestant in his military records for 27 years. Because the military system he served in would not allow him to be promoted with his true identity. Many people have urged me to tell his story, and some even have personal connections to this history. I hope to tell this story in a way that does justice to him. You can walk into any bookstore in America, go to the World War II section, and you will see shelf after shelf full of books about Patton, multiple biographies of Eisenhower, multiple editions of Bradley's memoirs, and the legend of MacArthur told repeatedly. Even Mark Clark, considered by most serious historians as a narcissist who sacrificed soldiers for headlines, has more related works than the general we are talking about today. Maurice Rose did not get his first serious biography until 2003, 58 years after his death. 58 years later, historian Stephen Noe S. Sadden's 2nd Armored Division veteran Don Marsh co-published Major General Maurice Rose, finally bringing this most forgotten commander of World War II to public attention. Part of the reason is the lack of historical materials. Rose's personal letters were destroyed in a flood, and his military records are far fewer than those of his colleagues who survived the war and spent decades giving interviews and writing memoirs. Military history journals wrote in reviewing this biography that as an ordinary person, Rose is basically unknowable to us. But the key difference is that while Rose, the private, individual, may be unknowable, Rose, the battlefield commander, is crystal clear. The records he left on the battlefield are extremely detailed, specifically documented in after-action reports, military histories, division records, and medal citations. The 3rd Armored Division under Rose's command achieved battle records that other U.S. armored divisions could not hope to match. The problem was never a lack of evidence, but simply that no one was willing to dig it up. The reasons for the lack of attention formed a complete closed loop, and this closed loop is the core of the story. Rose died on the eve of victory, so he was unable to participate in shaping the historical narrative after the war. He was extremely introverted, as recorded in the official history of the 3rd Armored Division, and almost never actively sought personal exposure. He never attended West Point, so he had no alumni network to promote his name. More importantly, he was a Jewish officer, and the military environment at the time gave him every reason to believe that his identity would be an obstacle to his career. These factors might be overcome individually, but together they formed an insurmountable barrier. Now, let me tell you what kind of person Maurice Rose really was. Maurice Rose was born on November 26, 1899, in Middletown, Connecticut, on the eve of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. His father, Samuel Rose, originally named Samuel Rose, came to America from Warsaw in 1883 to escape the Jewish Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. He was the son of a prominent rabbi in Warsaw, and his family was one of the leading Jewish academic centers in Poland. In 1893, Samuel married Catherine Bronowitz, also an immigrant from Warsaw, and the family eventually settled in the vibrant Jewish community of the Whittier neighborhood in East Denver. Samuel first worked as a tailor, then became a women's clothing designer, and finally served as the secular rabbi of Beth Medrash Hag Adol Synagogue for more than 40 years. The young Maurice completed his Jewish bar mitzvah, spoke Yiddish at his bar mitzvah, read Hebrew, and sang in the synagogue choir. He was also an Eagle Scout, an honor student at Denver East High School, editor of the school newspaper, and a member of the debate team. In the yearbook cartoon, he was carrying a rifle, which now seems like a prophecy. In 1916, he graduated with honors, never attended college, and never went to a military academy. Over the next 29 years, all his achievements were achieved without the institutional background that the Army hiked him and considered a ticket to high command. This is critically important because when later generations decided who should be remembered and who should be forgotten, Rose had no West Point alumni to advocate for him. The military attracted him early. At the age of 16, he hitchhiked to a Colorado National Guard camp and lied about his age to enlist. His parents refused to sign and brought him back, and he was honorably discharged after 6 weeks of service. In April 1917, America entered World War I, and Rose applied to the officer training camp at Fort Riley, Kansas, again falsifying his birth year. It changed 1899 to 1895 to meet the minimum age requirement of 21. In August 1917, he graduated from Officer Candidate School as an Infantry Reserve Second Lieutenant, assigned to the 89th Infantry Division, 353rd Infantry Regiment. In September 1918, Rose experienced brutal combat in the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in France, a battle that taught him that war was nothing like the romantic adventure he had imagined as a boy. He watched comrades fall in the front lines, spending life-changing months in mud and artillery fire. After World War I ended, Rose chose to stay in the Army, an unusual decision at the time. Most officers chose to return to civilian life, but Rose seemed to have found his mission in the military. However, the path to promotion was not smooth. In 1919, he was demoted to first lieutenant, becoming one of the few Jewish officers to remain in the regular army. In the American Army of the 1920s, anti-Semitism, while not as blatant as in Europe, did exist as a subtle, systemic prejudice. Rose chose a difficult but effective path. He registered himself as a Protestant. This decision was not a betrayal of his faith, but a to survive and advance in a system prejudiced against Jews. In his private life, he remained a Jew, still participating in Jewish holiday celebrations, but in official military records, his religion was always listed as Protestant. This decision allowed him to be promoted continuously over the next 27 years, from first lieutenant all the way to star general, but at the cost of having to hide his true identity forever. In the 1930s, Rose began working with armored forces, which would become the turning point of his life's career. He studied at the Cavalry School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and was later assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, which was then transitioning from cavalry to armor. Rose that tanks would become the decisive weapon of future warfare, and he threw himself wholeheartedly into this new military field. He studied German armored tactics, read the works of Guderian, and observed German performance in the Spanish Civil War. When World War II broke out in Europe, Rose was already one of the most knowledgeable officers in the U.S. Army about armored warfare. After the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, America entered the war fully, and Rose was appointed as a regimental commander in the 2nd Armored Division with George Patton as the division commander. Patton and Rose were completely different types of people. Patton was flamboyant, loved the spotlight, and craved media attention. Rose was introverted and focused solely on battle records. But the two men were in complete agreement on one point. They both believed that the core of armored warfare was speed and shock, and both advocated that commanders should lead from the front. Under Patton, Rose learned a great deal, but also developed his own unique command style. In 1943, Rose was transferred to the 3rd Armored Division, a newly formed heavy armored division, equipped with M4 Sherman tanks and later the M26 Pershing heavy tank. In January 1944, Rose officially took command of the 3rd Armored Division at 45 years old, one of the youngest division commanders in the U.S. Army. The soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division quickly discovered that their new division commander was different. Rose never stayed in a command tent in the rear. He always rode in an open jeep at the head of the armored column. His jeep was equipped with a radio, its antenna held high, becoming the most visible target in the entire division. His aides repeatedly urged him to be careful, but Rose always replied a general should stand at the forefront. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, the 3rd Armored Division came ashore in France in late June as follow-on forces. Rose had waited 27 years for this day. From the Normandy beaches to the German border, the 3rd Armored Division, under Rose's command, created a series of astonishing battle records. They broke through German lines in the Battle of St. Lo, cut off German retreat routes in the Falaise Pocket, were the first to rush down the Champs-Élysées in the liberation of Paris. They held off elite German armored forces in the Battle of the Bulge and established the first bridgehead in the Rhine crossing. The speed of the 3rd Armored Division's attacks terrified the Germans, who called this American Armored Division Rose's Iron Stream. Rose's command philosophy was simple and powerful. Speed is everything, shock is everything, and a commander's courage is everything. He always made decisions at the front, with no radio delay, no information distortion, no layers of. He saw the terrain with his own eyes and made decisions on the spot about the enemy situation. Veterans of the 3rd Armored Division later recalled that as long as they saw Rose's jeep appear ahead, they knew victory was at hand. The soldiers knew that their general would never send them anywhere he wouldn't go himself. Rose thus earned the nearly worshipful loyalty of his troops. Corps Commander Collins described him as tall and handsome, with a fine appearance and a military bearing that commanded respect even on the battlefield. According to O.S. Sad and Marsh's biography, the soldiers knew that the general would never send them to a place he wasn't willing to go himself. Thus, their rapid advance in fighting became the benchmark for all armored forces on the Western Front. In September 1944, the 3rd Armored Division, in coordination with the 7th Army in Belgium, conducted a large-scale encirclement operation, cutting off German retreat routes and sealing German escape routes. Rose's tanks blocked all escape routes until the German forces destroyed overnight by long-range attacks. The result of this battle was that approximately 25,000 German soldiers were captured by the 3rd Armored Division, for generals and an entire military division, while only 57 men were killed in the 3rd Armored Division. Because of this, Rose was awarded the title of Commander-in-Chief of the 7th Army and later called the world's top commander when he died. On September 12, 1944, the 3rd Armored Division attacked the town of Stolberg in the Hürtgen forest area, becoming the first American unit to enter a German town. 3 days later, it became the first Allied unit to break through the Siegfried Line. This was the first unit to break through the Siegfried Line, It became the first armored division to break through the Siegfried Line, and it was the first armored division to break through the Siegfried Line. Rose's division was not only part of the invasion of Germany, but was the vanguard on every front of the war. In the autumn of 1944, the war entered its most difficult phase. Bradley's forces head into the dead-end battlefield of the Hurtgen Forest, one of the most brutal battlefields in the southern county. Rose's 3rd Armored Division fought in outpost and siege operations in the town of Stolberg. Combat forces advanced house by house through German fortified positions in the industrial belt east of the Siegfried Line, with the enemy retreating to their homeland and defending with desperate determination. Casualties surged, with replacement troops assigned to tanks and going into combat the same day, some lasting only a few hours. Rose still led his troops forward, well aware of the truth later summarized by General Bulger in Armored Warfare: momentum is everything. Once you stop, the enemy will fortify their positions, and the next attack will cost twice as much blood. From December 1940 to January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge broke out. The 3rd Armored Division held a key position on the northern flank of the German breakthrough with the Meuse River behind them. Once the Germans broke through, they could seize the crossing and split the Allied lines. Troops were thrown into battle, facing the Waffen-SS armored spearhead of the Kampf Gruppe Peiper. The division secured a 3 million-gallon fuel depot at Stavelot, preventing the Germans from obtaining logistical supplies that could have extended the offensive for weeks or even months. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, the 3rd Armored Division destroyed 98 German tanks. Troops fought in sub-zero cold, with terrain negating armor mobility advantages, and tank crews could only sleep inside their vehicles, getting frostbite within hours of getting out in the snow. Task Force Hogan was surrounded at Malmedy, fuel exhausted, assault cut off, enemy situation unknown. Rose made an extremely bold decision: order the destruction of all vehicles and heavy equipment, and break out on foot through enemy lines. If this order failed, it could have ended his career. On Christmas Day, 400 men crossed 12 miles of frozen enemy-occupied forest, with all returning safely. The 400 Hogan heroes made the cover of Stars and Stripes, newsreels, and newspapers across America. This boldness, this unconventional way of trusting subordinates to accomplish impossible tasks, was exactly the hallmark of Rose. In March 1945, the division captured Cologne in brutal street fighting, staging one of the most famous tank duels of World War II. An M26 Pershing heavy tank of the 3rd Armored Division destroyed a German Panther tank near Cologne Cathedral, with an Army Signal Corps photographer capturing the entire scene of Corporal Clarence Smoyer firing at close range and penetrating the side of the Panther. This photograph became one of the most iconic images of World War II. After the Battle of Cologne, the 3rd Armored Division continued pushing into the German heartland, with Rose still leading from the front. On March 30th, 1945, outside Paderborn, 5 weeks before the war ended, the 3rd Armored Division was pursuing German forces fleeing westward. And Rose, as usual, was riding in his open jeep at the head of the armored column. That night, the sky was dark, the road was chaotic, with retreating Germans, refugees, and destroyed vehicles mixed together. Rose's jeep passed his own lead tanks, and suddenly they encountered a retreating German Panther tank. The German tank commander opened his hatch and fired a submachine gun at Rose's jeep. Rose was hit on the spot, only 45 years old. He was the highest-ranking U.S. military officer killed in the European theater, and also the highest-ranking American officer killed in action against Germany during World War II. When the news reached the 3rd Armored Division, the entire division fell into profound grief. The soldiers could not believe that the general who always led from the front, the general who always fought alongside them, was gone like that. When Corps Commander General Collins received the news, he was silent for a long time, then said, "We have lost our finest division commander." Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "Rose's death is a tremendous loss. He was one of our bravest and finest soldiers." Army Chief of Staff General Marshall paid public tribute, calling him a great American soldier. Yet, just 5 weeks later, when the war ended, the military's propaganda machine went into full swing, with Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, and MacArthur becoming household names, while the name of Maurice Rose was quietly forgotten. This was no accident. Rose died on the eve of victory, so he was unable to participate in shaping the historical narrative after the war. He was extremely introverted, almost never actively sought personal exposure. He never attended West Point, so he had no alumni network to promote his name. More importantly, he was a Jewish officer, and the military and social environment at the time made his identity an awkward topic. 58 years later, in 2003, historian Steve, a No.S. saddened 2nd Armored Division veteran on Marsh co-published Major General Maurice Rose, finally bringing this most forgotten commander of World War back to public attention. The Washington Times commented that Rose's name should stand alongside Patton's. Patton's authoritative biographer Carlo D'Este strongly recommended it. In 2020, Bulgar's tank killers systematically rose as the Great Armored Division commander, writing as a retired lieutenant general. In 2019, Max Faulkner, Rose's Final Moments from a Soldier's Perspective, and German Historical Materials. 3 books together built a historical verdict that should have been completed decades ago. But books cannot erase 80 years of institutional forgetting. American World War to memory is dominated by survivors. Eisenhower became president, Bradley became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Patton became even more famous after his death, while Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who also died before the war ended, had powerful family connections. Meanwhile, Rose had none of that. Yet, despite the institutional forgetting, the courage of Rose and his men will never be truly erased, because there are always people who refuse to let history be forgotten. People like O.S. Saddened Marsh, who spent years researching and writing Rose's biography. People like Bulgar, who used his own experience as a retired lieutenant general to Rose as the greatest. People like Faulkner, who Rose's final moments so we can finally know what happened. And people like you who are watching this, who are willing to listen to forgotten stories. Because remembering the forgotten is how we honor their sacrifice. And that is the least we can do for those who gave everything. So the next time you walk into a bookstore and see all those books about Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, and MacArthur, take a moment to also remember Maurice Rose, the 2-star general who rode in an open jeep at the head of his armored column, who always led from the front because he believed a general should stand at the forefront, who had to hide his Jewish identity for 27 years, who captured more enemy soldiers than any other armored division commander, who was called the best division commander in the business, who was called one of our bravest and finest soldiers, who was called a great American soldier, and whose name deserves to stand alongside Patton's. That's the story of Maurice Rose, the forgotten hero of World War II. May we never forget. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others.